The first Grand Prix of the 1959 season. To the astonishment of the crowds, the red Ferraris are being pressed by strange, small British cars. They are rear-engined Cooper Climaxes, number 30 being driven by Stirling Moss. A lone Cooper had won last year, but only after the opposition had fallen out. Now, in 1959, Moss falls out with gearbox trouble. But Australian Jack Brabham on 24 is unstoppable. And unbelievably, the funny car with the engine in the wrong place wins. Grand Prix racing is about to be changed forever. There was nothing new about rear, or more accurately, mid-engined cars. The pre-war auto unions were such. In 1947, John Cooper had welded two crashed Fiat 500 frames together for Formula 3 racing. The car was successful and he went into production. Journalist John Bolster, on the right, could be forgiven for not perceiving that the motorcycle-powered cars were to become the Grand Prix cars of the future. Coopers were fun, to be sure, but not to be taken seriously. Brands Hatch in the early 50s, a Formula 3 race in heavy rain. On the slippery track, a Cooper inadvertently demonstrates the low polar inertia, or dumbbell effect, of the mid-engine car, which has its centre of gravity between the wheels. The Coopers had transverse leaf-springing front and rear, with hydraulic dampers and brakes. A solid back axle transmitted the drive. The cockpit was cramped, but the car had a very slim profile. Engines varied. This one has a 499 Jap. Jap in those days stood for J.A. Prestwich. Behind the driver, the engine and gearbox with final drive by chain.
Right, we're
John Watson tests a Formula 3 Cooper. The rollover bar is a recent addition.
Forget, let it just go pop, pop, pop in neutral, and then slowly let it go. Okay, forward, forward. It's a lot of fun. I can understand why 500cc racing was so popular. It feels very much like a modern car, although it's a car 30 years of age or more. It must have been a great deal of fun to race. The concept of this 500cc Cooper is very, very similar indeed to a modern car. The actual layout, the rear engine, again all the weight between the wheels, in many respects it's very similar to a modern Grand Prix car. It doesn't seem to be 30 years of age.
Coming events cast their shadows before them. Why had no one foreseen the virtues of the rear-engined Coopers?
Any progress that was made in Formula One was primarily with engine development, not so much about chassis. I think that in the case of Ferrari in particular, his idea of Formula One racing was that the engine was the heart of the car, and that's where all the progress was made. Everything else had to fit in around that, whereas what John Cooper and his father Charles did was they made, maybe by accident as much as design, a very modern car which was ahead of its time, and therefore I'm surprised that no one within Formula One took up the theory of this design earlier and took advantage of the advantages that it does have.
In the late 50s, following the withdrawal of Mercedes-Benz, Grand Prix racing was once again dominated by the Italians, the 250F Maserati in particular. But by 1958, that classic car had reached the end of its development. The Dino Ferrari, on the other hand, was then new, and Mike Hawthorne was to win the World Championship with it, beating Stirling Moss by a single point. Willie Green, who drives the Ferrari in historic races, briefs John Watson, who is to test drive this superbly restored Dino, named after Ferrari's son, who had tragically died.
Believe it or believe it not, this is the first time ever I've ever driven, or first time ever I've driven a Grand Prix Ferrari, let alone any Ferrari, I think, sports car or otherwise, so...
Well, they do have a personality of their own, you'll soon find it.
Yeah, I hope I do.
Lovely engine. quite straightforward. You just got the cutout switch on the magneto.
Right.
You have a back-to-front gearbox on this, which is all marked, so we go from first right across to where fourth would normally be. You can rev this one high, you can rev it to about 8.
Okay.
Right,
Thank you.
here we go. Yes, you've also got the brake on.
The pedals are.
Okay.
The engine is a V6.
Glorious. I mean, even though it's 6, Ferrari make a 6 sound like a 12. It's a surprise, because I never anticipated that any front-engine Ferrari was ever any good anyway. It's got a lot more RPM. I mean, you've got a much wider rev band, and also it's very torquey, which, the V6 you would probably expect it to be. I felt much more comfortable immediately, particularly around here. It's got good power, top end, and it pulls low down, which means, from a driving point of view, should mean less gear change, particularly on circuits where you've got a sequence of bends at low speed flowing. You can hold the gear longer than maybe in another car with a narrower rev band, which I think is important from purely driving, that you do the least amount of work. In most cases, helps the car.
John Watson is unaccustomed to driving without a full harness.
It's a strange feeling. I feel sort of very insecure and uncomfortable to some extent, but you forget about it, in fact, because the enjoyment and pleasure of driving soon takes over. I think you have to judge it by what people did at the time, and they raced cars. And in this kind of car, I suspect, because you've got a lot of space in the cockpit, if you're unfortunate enough to get into an accident, in many cases it was actually safer to pop out of it. I mean, you just sort of got spat out of the cockpit. In the 50s, I think drivers could combine a sort of a joie de vivre attitude. I mean, even people like Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, who were maybe more easygoing in their attitude compared to, say, Stirling Moss, were capable of winning Grand Prix, and of course Mike Hawthorne was the first British driver to win the World Drivers' Championship.
How did the Ferrari compare with the Mercedes?
I think that the Mercedes as a company, they had limitations, in fact, because with their rear suspension design, they had a low pivot swing axle, which was based on their passenger car. The company wouldn't allow them to make a fully independent rear suspension like the Ferrari has here, because the passenger car didn't have it. So they actually had limitations within the company as to what they could do. But I think had they gone on and raced in 56, 7, 8 and 9 when this car then came into its own, I suspect that Mercedes might have come up with something rather radical. They would have probably abandoned the front engine concept and gone rear engine and sort of really caught everybody in the hop.
As has been said, the Italians were first and foremost engine builders, of which the V6 Dino Ferrari was a superb example. The earlier Maserati 250F was still good enough in 1957 to enable Fangio to win his 5th and final World Championship. It seemed improbable that an ex-fire pump engine could seriously challenge the Italians. The early 1.5-litre Climax engines were fitted to a rear-engine Cooper sports car, which was to have some quite well-known drivers. The Climax engines were, of course, adapted for racing, with twin-choke carburetors and a 4-speed gearbox, which had equally humble origins. The lightweight rear-engine Cooper handled well, but for Formula One, more power was required. John Cooper was sent to Coventry, where
we persuaded them to build the first one was 1,000, then a 1,500, and then they designed a twin-cam 1,500, which we stretched to 1,750, which again was stretched to 2 litres and then 2.2, and eventually, after giving Mr. Lee, the chairman of Coventry Climax, a few more gin and tonics, we got a 2.5 designed for us properly.
As Cooper restorer Sid Hoole demonstrates, the secret of the Climax engine was its very light alloy cylinder, block and head. The chassis of the Formula One car was, like the earlier 500s, welded from lightweight steel tubing, from a design which was simply chalked on the workshop floor. A consultant engineer would have frowned on the curved tubing, but the frame was light and rigid, and ready for the 1959 Formula One Cooper. It was powered by the 2.5-litre twin-cam Climax engine. Transverse leaf springs were employed as on the 500s, and the gearbox was modified from a Citroën Light 15. But the 1959 Coopers were not the only British Grand Prix cars. There were others. A new Aston Martin, and the P25 BRM, a 4-cylinder successor to the ill-fated V16. These cars intrigued the newsreels, which paid scant attention to the Cooper.
They're preparing for the International Trophy at Silverstone, a foretaste of the Grand Prix season. Fast cars and the folk who drive them. Maria Teresa de Filipis, the first woman to enter a British Formula One race since before the war. Sterling Moss, BRM. Roy Salvadori to drive one of the new Aston Martins. Jack Brabham, Cooper. Tony Brooks, Ferrari. The Duke of Kent, keen spectator with the camera as the starting flag falls. .150 miles to go and two big questions. Will the latest BRMs hold their own? And how will the new Aston Martins fare in their racing debut? Here are the answers. Flockhart's BRM took third place, and Aston Martin's made a dashing first appearance, Salvadori's car finishing second. Number 3 was the winner, the Cooper driven by Jack.
In 1959, Sterling Moss acquired a Cooper. He liked the handling, but thought the cars underpowered.
Well, although they were underpowered, of course they were, but the point is that because they were so easy to drive, you could drive yourself so hard that and the car would take it. They were relatively reliable machines, and the brakes were good, and of course you could usually outbrake the faster cars, stop a little bit later. So swings and roundabouts, really and truly on a complete lap, they weren't that much down on the faster cars. But in honesty, the Cooper was so easy and nimble and easy to throw around and place compared with, shall we say, your Van Wars or Mercs or even cars like this, that it was a delight to suddenly get in one of those.
59 was to be Cooper's year. The British cars, when driven by Moss and Brabham, seemed to win everywhere. Not only on sinuous circuits like Monaco, but also on faster courses too. The British Grand Prix at Aintree, where Moss forsook his Cooper to drive a new BRM. But the front-engined car could not beat the Cooper, driven to victory by Jack Brabham. Ferrari drivers tried everything, but the rear-engined revolution was irreversible. Jack Brabham winning the 1959 Drivers' Championship, with John Cooper taking the Constructors' Trophy. By 1960, others too had seen the light, principally Lotus builder Colin Chapman.
I mean, Colin was very good and very quick. Good engineer, and I mean, he realised that the only way to win Grand Prix was going to be a rear-engine car. By the time we went to the Argentine, which was early January, we still had the old cars. He turned up with a very light rear-engine motor car driven by Ellis Island, and nearly blew us off with it if it hadn't broken, because Colin's cars were a bit light and they did break in those days. And coming back on the aeroplane, Jack and Bruce and I said, we've got to have a new car for this season if we're going to win in 1960.
The 1960 Cooper incorporated the experience gained in previous years. The engine was still the 2.5-litre unit. The space frame chassis was refined. Coil springs replacing the transverse leaf. Adjustable suspension permitted precise tuning of the handling. The 1960 car was good enough to win Cooper and Brabham their second World Championships.
The concept that this car pioneered really is still with us. There's nothing changed other than the innovation of aerodynamics in a car, but the basic idea with the engine behind the driver and the driver relatively close to the front wheels is what we have today. The advantage that a car like the Cooper has, first of all, it is rear engine, which gives a much smaller frontal area, which means that the car can penetrate the air more easily for less horsepower. But also the light weight of the car is significant. The whole of the car, I'm sure, must have been 100 pounds or maybe more lighter than the Ferrari of the day or any other front-engine car. Everything was just better. It was such an advance. It didn't need to have the horsepower that, say, the Ferrari had at that particular time. This is quicker, mainly because it's got a lighter weight and it's a smaller car. It's an ideal car for most situations, particularly circuits like Monaco, which were very tight, sinuous circuits. The size of this car and its maneuverability would have made it probably a lot easier to drive, a lot less physically tiring to drive.
It was the development of the Climax engine which made Cooper's cars competitive. Colin Chapman also saw the virtues of that engine. He too fitted it to a lightweight frame, but placed it conventionally in front of the driver. The car was the Lotus 16, which is now seen as something of a milestone.
I think milestone, yes. It's a strange experience because having, I think, sat on some of the earlier cars I've driven, we're back now to being a long way from the front wheels, but instead of sitting on the car, I'm actually sitting in the car. And the whole line of the car, it's so low, you can't get any lower. If you are, your backside's going to be bouncing off the ground. So sort of the view that I get sitting in the seat is really very similar to what I would feel in a contemporary car. I suspect that the success or lack of success of the car really wasn't so much from the fundamental design of the car. It was really dear old Colin Chapman pinching here and pinching there on the design of the car, trying to save weight, on reliability. But in fact, we've seen in these Lotus 16s racing, in historic racing, that the car is extremely competitive. In fact, I would not be surprised that if you could have taken this car, put it into a time warp back to 59 or 58, it would have been winning Grand Prix. Colin Chapman took a long time to discover what it takes to win races. Having a brilliant design, an innovative design, is not enough. It takes engineering and a good team, the backup. And during his early days in Formula One, this really was, I suppose, a second attempt at a Formula One car. He really hadn't yet learnt or come to terms with what is necessary. I still have a feeling that if Colin Chapman had built the Lotus 16 the way it is run today by the owners of the cars, it would have been much, much more successful. And I'm not sure that in pure handling terms, which of the two concepts is better. I think that had the Chapman Lotus 16 been perfected at the time it was being raced, it may have delayed the changeover, certainly from Lotus' point of view. But of course what happened was that because Cooper were very successful in 59 and 60, it prompted Chapman to introduce a rear-engine car.
That was the Lotus 18. Stirling Moss drove one to what is now regarded as his greatest victory, the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix. It was the first race of a new Formula One, with engines limited to 1.5 litres Ferrari had entered. When John Cooper saw his cars, he remembered a conversation he had had with Ferrari.
I said, what do you think of the mid-engined Grand Prix car? And he said, oh no, he said, I will never build a mid-engined car. The engine is right for a Grand Prix car must be in the front.
The shark-nosed Ferrari 156s were rear-engined and looked impressive. Stirling Moss had a year-old Lotus 18, the newer 21s being unavailable to him for contractual reasons. The drivers are briefed for the grueling 100-lap Monaco race. The field included Lotus, Cooper, Ferrari, Porsche and BRM, all rear-engined. A situation unthinkable just 3 years previously. Moss, in his outdated car, had taken the lead by lap 5. The Ferraris had a new 1.5-litre V6 engine, which was reputed to develop 190 horsepower. Moss sets up the fastest lap in 1 minute 36 seconds. The works Porsches are very fast too, for they have fuel injection, that are handicapped on this tight circuit by drum brakes. There had been fears that the 1.5-litre cars would produce dull racing, but the 1961 Monaco was developing into a classic. Richie Ginter, on a Ferrari, equals Moss's fastest lap. By sheer brilliance of driving on this driver's circuit, Stirling Moss, whose engine was at least 20 horsepower down on the Ferraris, kept his Lotus ahead to win his greatest victory. It was sadly to be his last Monaco. For the following Easter, at a minor meeting at Goodwood, Stirling Moss, who is now known as the greatest driver never to be world champion, was to crash. The circumstances of his accident have never been satisfactorily explained. Moss left the track to hit a bank at St Mary's at 120 miles per hour, sustaining grievous injuries.
I was paralysed I was unconscious for a month, paralysed for 6 months, but I had enormous pressure on me by the press, which was most gratifying. The people wanted, are you going to race again? And I really wanted to. And I kept saying, well, oh, yes. And then I tried myself out. And in this test that I did, I could see that I reckon I had the ability, but I hadn't got the concentration. And my times were not bad. But I could see that when I suddenly be going down the straight and think, my God, I should be braking by now. The automatic part had gone, and I think that was because of my lack of concentration. If I'd waited 2 or 3 years, that did come back, and I think I would have probably made a different decision and probably be a far richer man now, actually.
As always, new men and new cars. It is 1962 and the British Grand Prix at Aintree. Jack Brabham is driving a Lotus. Phil Hill, the first American driver to be world champion since 1921, is driving a Ferrari. The Porsche of Gilles Bonnier, requiring a detachable steering wheel to admit the driver. Colin Chapman briefs Jim Clark, who is to drive a Lotus 25. A new rear-engined BRM to be driven by Graham Hill. A new name, Lola, driven by John Surtees, the only man to be world champion on 2 and 4 wheels.
Now, hold on to your hats. "75 laps and 27 of the fastest cars in the world lapping them up. Jim Clark took the lead right from the word go. John Surtees occupied second place for most of the distance. Surtees again closely followed by Bruce McLaren. And as to putting on the heat, just look at that heat shimmer on the track. The surface was dry, but there were still a few anxious moments. In spite of losing a gear early on, Surtees drove his Lola into a very creditable second place, for there wasn't a hope of catching Clark. The young Scottish farmer notched the fastest lap and went on to win at over 92.
Jim Clark and Colin Chapman stand on the threshold of a new era. From the 1951 Alfa Romeo to the 1963 Lotus 25. John Watson was asked about the cars he had driven for the series.
Each car in itself is very special, and I suppose in many respects the Maserati has to be considered the classic Formula One car of the 50s, although driving the factory Mercedes was a unique opportunity. A chance to drive a factory Mercedes at any time is very special. Really what 50s Formula One racing was an extension of what we had seen in the 30s. And the cars, in fact, were just a refinement and development of the 30s Grand Prix cars. Romantic era, I mean, it was, cars looked like people imagined Grand Prix cars to look like. It's nostalgic to look back on them, and it's wrong to maybe complain that current Grand Prix cars are nothing like the cars of the 50s. But growing up in that era when Grand Prix racing was about men and machines and not about technology, which is what it is today, my nostalgia is very much of the 50s. It's a period where I was very influenced by what I read about and I very occasionally got to see.
The 1950 Grand Prix at Silverstone. The cars are 1.5 litre supercharged. The same race in 1963.
And they're away, 246 miles, 82 laps.
The cars are 1.5 litres unsupercharged.
Jim Clark's Lotus Climax, number 4, out in front. Dan Gurney, driving a Brabham Climax, number 9, was on his tail until engine trouble caught up with him. Now the battle for second position was between Graham Hill and a BRM, number 1, fighting it out with John Surtees' Ferrari, number 10. Yet another motorcyclist trying out 4 wheels.
The formula will change in 1965 to 3 litres unsupercharged. The return to power, it'll be called. In reality, it'll be the departure to commercialism, and small firms like Cooper and Climax will be replaced by multinationals. Grand Prix racing will become part of international entertainment. The days of the amateur will forever vanish.
Jim Clark wins at over 107 miles an hour. Quite a burn-up. He's now won 4 Grand Prix races this season and leads by 19 points for the World Championship.
Grand Prix had come a long way from John Cooper's 1959 workshop.
In '59, our budget for the Formula One team was £50,000, which I suppose would be equivalent to about 500,000 today. Whereas they normally today, I think a Formula One team is talking about 15 to 20 million.
These cars of the 80s are the most powerful and certainly the most expensive ever built. But the question remains, do they represent progress or simply improved means to unimproved ends?